The message arrived on a Tuesday, which Ambassador Lena Ortega would later consider a small and meaningless detail that her brain chose to remember anyway. It came through the Deep Space Relay Network in the form of a crystalline data packet, wrapped in the diplomatic encryption of the conclave of aligned species, and it was addressed not to any single nation of Earth, but to the governing authority of the human nursery civilization. A phrase that made Ortega set down her coffee and read the whole thing twice before she trusted herself to speak. The conclave was inviting humanity to a peace summit. That alone would have been enough to raise eyebrows across every government on Earth, on Mars, and on the dozen colony worlds that now bore human names and human flags. But the details made it stranger still. The summit was to be held aboard Aethon Ring, a massive diplomatic station that orbited a dead star in neutral space, and the matter to be discussed was the future of 3 human worlds that sat in the path of the Valeth Dominion's expansion: Elysium, Port Haldane, and New Svalbard. 3 names that meant everything to the families who lived there, and apparently very little to the alien empires who had already decided those worlds were bargaining chips. Ortega had spent 20 years in diplomacy, and another 5 before that in the Martian insurrection, where she had learned the only lesson that ever truly mattered. Words were just sounds, unless someone with a weapon stood behind them. And even then, the weapon only mattered if the person holding it was willing to use it. She read the invitation a 3rd time, and noticed what was missing from it. There was no mention of human sovereignty, no acknowledgement of existing borders, and no indication that humanity had any say in whether the Valeth could take those worlds or not. The summit was framed as a generous opportunity for the nursery species to accept whatever terms the elder civilizations had already agreed upon. She forwarded the message to Admiral Tobias Wren before she forwarded it to anyone else. Wren was the commander of the United Terran Navy's 7th Expeditionary Fleet, and the kind of man who smiled rarely, but meant it every time he did. He was 63 years old, built like a piece of industrial equipment that had been left out in the rain, and he had fought in more engagements than most alien species believed humans had survived. He called her within the hour. "You're going to accept the invitation," he said, and it was not a question. "I'm going to accept the invitation," she confirmed. "Good. Talk as long as you can, Lena. Buy us time if you can buy us nothing else. But know that while you're sitting at that table, the 7th Fleet will be positioned at the Callaway Corridor, and we will not be sleeping." The Callaway Corridor was the only navigable passage between Valeth space and human territory. Narrow channel, squeezed between 2 nebulae, that made faster-than-light travel impossible anywhere else in the region. Whoever held the corridor held the door to human space, and Wren intended to be standing in that doorway with every ship he had. Ortega assembled her delegation carefully. She chose people who could sit in a room full of beings that considered them insects and never once flinch. People who understood that silence was a weapon and patience was ammunition. People who had read enough history to know that the worst treaties in human civilization had been signed by those who were too afraid to walk away from the table. They departed Earth aboard the diplomatic cruiser Meridian, a ship that was fast and well-armored, but deliberately modest in appearance. Humanity had learned long ago that showing wealth to those who intended to rob you was not a strategy, but an invitation. The journey to Aethon Ring took 11 days, and during those 11 days, the galaxy talked about the upcoming summit with the kind of mild amusement that a group of adults might show when watching a child try to negotiate for a later bedtime. The Valeth Dominion was an insectoid empire that had been conquering and absorbing other species for over 4,000 years. They were enormous, armored, and operated under a hive mind structure that made them terrifyingly efficient in both war and diplomacy. Their overmind, a being called Sethic, had never lost a territorial dispute because no species had ever been foolish enough to refuse his terms, once the Valeth war machine began to move. The Rhythani Collective, ancient aquatic telepaths who served as the Conclave's primary mediators, had already begun drafting what they called a compromise framework, which Ortega's intelligence team decoded and found to be nothing more than a list of human concessions dressed up in diplomatic language. The Tohari Ascendancy, silicon-based giants who served as the Conclave's enforcers, had made no public statement, which was itself a statement. The Tohari only spoke when they intended to act, and their silence meant they considered the matter already settled. 43 species made up the conclave of aligned species, and not one of them expected humanity to do anything other than bow its head and accept the loss of 2 worlds in exchange for being allowed to keep the third. Humanity was young, barely a century among the stars, and in the long memory of the galaxy, young species did not fight. They folded. They accepted their place at the bottom of a hierarchy that had existed since before human beings had learned to make fire. But the galaxy did not know Lina Ortega, and the galaxy did not know Tobias Wren, and the galaxy had made the mistake that powerful beings have made since the beginning of time in every civilization on every world. They had confused youth with weakness, and silence with submission. The diplomatic chamber aboard Aethon Ring had been designed to make smaller species feel exactly that. Small. The ceiling rose so high above the floor that clouds of condensation gathered near the top, lit from within by bioluminescent panels that shifted color in slow waves meant to soothe the nervous systems of most known species. Most, but not all, because the light frequencies did nothing for human biology, and Ortega suspected that was not an accident. The table at the center of the chamber was a single curved slab of polished stone quarried from a moon that no longer existed, and around it sat delegations from 12 species, though only 4 truly mattered: the Valith Dominion, the Rhythani Collective, the Tohari Ascendancy, and the small human delegation that had been given seats at the far end, as distant from the center as it was possible to be without being placed outside the room entirely. Ortega noted the seating arrangement and said nothing about it. She simply sat down, opened her data tablet, and waited. The Rhythani mediator, a being called Soval, who resembled a 6-meter eel, suspended in a hovering column of water, opened the proceedings with a speech about the sacred tradition of dialogue among civilized species that lasted 45 minutes and said absolutely nothing of substance. Ortega listened to every word and wrote down 3. Then the Valith spoke. Overmind Sethic was massive even by the standards of his kind, nearly 4 meters tall, covered in segmented black carapace that gleamed under the shifting lights, with compound eyes that reflected the room in 1,000 tiny fractured images. When he spoke, his mandibles produced sounds that the translation systems converted into a voice that was calm and measured, and utterly without warmth. The Valith Dominion recognizes the presence of the human delegation, Sethic began, and in a spirit of generosity unprecedented in our dealings with nursery civilizations, we offer the following terms. The human species may retain sovereign control of the world designated Elysium, provided that the worlds designated Port Haldane and New Svalbard are ceded to the Dominion, and that transit rights through 7 additional human systems are granted for Valith military and commercial vessels. He said this the way someone might read a grocery list, without emphasis, without passion, as though the displacement of 2 million human beings was a minor administrative matter barely worth the time it took to speak aloud. The Rhythani mediator turned its long body toward the human delegation and said, "The Conclave notes the extraordinary generosity of this proposal. In 12,000 years of recorded diplomacy, the Valith have never offered to leave even one world in the hands of a nursery species. The human delegation would be wise to recognize the significance of this gift." Ortega let the silence stretch for exactly 10 seconds. She had learned long ago that silence made powerful beings uncomfortable in ways that words never could. Then she spoke. "Thank you, Mediator Soval. I have several questions before we proceed, if the chamber will allow them." Soval rippled in what might have been surprise. Nursery species did not usually ask questions. They usually just agreed. But protocol demanded that questions be permitted, so the mediator gave its assent. Ortega looked down at her tablet, as though consulting notes, though in truth she had memorized everything on it before she ever boarded the Meridian. "My first question concerns the enforcement mechanism for transit rights. Specifically, who monitors Valith military vessels as they pass through human systems, and what recourse do human authorities have if those vessels deviate from approved transit corridors?" Sethic's mandibles clicked, a sound the translation system did not convert, but that Ortega's briefing. Materials identified as irritation. "Valith vessels do not deviate," Sethic said. "My second question," Ortega continued as though he had not spoken, "concerns the historical compliance rate of demilitarization treaties brokered by the Conclave. Our records indicate that of the 31 demilitarization agreements signed in the past 2,000 years, only 11 were still being honored after 1 decade. That is a compliance rate of approximately 34%. I would like to ask the mediator whether the Conclave considers this an acceptable foundation upon which to build a lasting peace." The chamber went very quiet. Soval did not answer immediately. The Rythani was not accustomed to being questioned about the Conclave's record, certainly not by a species that had been traveling between stars for less than a single Rythani lifespan. Several of the minor delegations shifted in their seats. The Krayliv ambassador, a reptilian being with more scars than scales, made a sound that might have been a laugh. "The Conclave's record speaks for itself," Soval finally said, which was both true and damning, and everyone in the room knew it. Ortega moved on. She asked about population transfer protocols, about property rights for displaced colonists, about the legal status of human citizens who refuse to leave ceded worlds. Each question was precise and specific, and each one forced the Valith and the Rythani to either admit uncomfortable truths or dodge the question in ways that were visible to every delegation in the chamber. She was not arguing. She was not raising her voice or making threats. She was simply asking questions that no nursery species had ever bothered to ask before, because nursery species were supposed to be grateful, not curious. Between sessions, the other delegations began to talk among themselves, and what they said was this: the humans were not behaving the way they were supposed to. Behave? The Tohari envoy, a being that resembled a mountain that had learned to walk, observed the proceedings from the back of the chamber without speaking. The Tohari had not spoken at a diplomatic summit in 6 years, and their silence had become so expected that most species forgot they were there, which was exactly what the Tohari preferred. But the Tohari envoy was watching the human delegation very closely, and what it saw was something it had not seen in a very long time. It saw a species that was not afraid. On the second day, Sethic's patience began to crack. Valith psychology did not handle prolonged uncertainty well, because in the hive mind structure of their civilization, decisions were made quickly and implemented immediately, and the idea that a nursery species might delay and question and probe was an insult that went deeper than mere politics. During an afternoon session, Sethic leaned forward across the table, his carapace creaking with the letter movement, and addressed Ortega directly. "Ambassador, your species is young and perhaps does not fully understand the reality of its position. The Valith have existed for 6,000 years and have absorbed civilizations far older and far stronger than yours. Your biology is fragile, your numbers are small, and your territory is exposed. The offer we have made is not merely generous, it is merciful, and mercy is not something the Dominion offers twice." The threat was barely veiled, and every delegation in the room understood it perfectly. Ortega looked at Sethic for a long moment. She did not blink, she did not shift in her seat, she did not look away from those thousand-faceted eyes. "Fragility is relative, Overmind," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "You should ask the Krayliv what they thought of our fragility at the siege of Broken Gate." The Krayliv ambassador made that sound again, definitely a laugh this time. The Krayliv remembered Broken Gate very well, where a single human destroyer had held a choke point for 11 hours against a Krayliv raiding flotilla, and had killed 4 ships before it was finally disabled, and the crew of that destroyer had been recovered alive and unbroken, and had asked their rescuers when they could go back to their ship. The talks recessed, and in the corridors of Aethon Ring, the delegations whispered to each other about what they had seen at the table. The humans had not agreed to anything. The humans had not conceded anything. The humans were taking notes. On the morning of the 3rd day, before the formal sessions resumed, the Rithani mediator requested a private meeting with Ambassador Ortega in a side chamber that smelled of salt water and ozone. Soval floated in its column of water and regarded Ortega with eyes that had no pupils, no whites, and no expression a human being could read. The Rithani were telepaths among their own kind, but they could not read human minds, which had always frustrated them in ways they would never admit. "Ambassador," Soval said, "I speak to you now not as a mediator, but as one who has watched civilizations rise and fall for longer than your species has possessed language. You are making a mistake. The Valith will not negotiate further, and if these talks fail, the consequences for your people will be severe." "I appreciate your concern," Ortega said. "I do not think you do," Soval replied, "because if you did, you would understand that the Conclave's economic framework sustains your colonies, your trade routes pass through Rithani-regulated space, your fuel depots operate under Conclave licensing. If the Conclave were to withdraw its support, your outer colonies would face shortages within 6 months, and crisis within a year." Ortega let the silence hang for a moment before she responded. "Mediator, is this a warning or a threat?" "It is a reality." "Then I will share a reality of my own. Humanity has faced shortages before. We have faced crisis before. We have faced extinction before, several times in fact, and every single time we survived it not because someone rescued us, but because we refused to stop. Your economic leverage is noted, and I will include it in my report. Is there anything else?" Soval said nothing more, and Ortega returned to her delegation's quarters, where her intelligence officer was waiting, with a face that told her everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth. "Intercepted a burst transmission 30 minutes ago," he said. "Valith fleet movements. Heavy capital ships repositioning along the Callaway corridor. At least 2,000 vessels in staged formation. Admiral Wren's people confirmed the signatures independently." He placed the data on the table in front of her. Timestamps, coordinates, ship classifications, energy signatures. The kind of information that could not be faked and could not be misinterpreted. The Valith had begun moving their warfleet into attack position 3 days before the peace summit started. 3 days before. Which meant the invasion had been planned long before any invitation was sent. The summit was never intended to produce peace. It was intended to produce delay. The Valith wanted humanity sitting at a table, talking and hoping and wasting time, while the real work happened in the dark, between stars. And the Conclave knew, they had to know, because the Rithani intelligence network saw everything that moved through the Orion Arm. And you could not reposition 2,000 warships without someone noticing. The Conclave knew, and they had said nothing. Because the Conclave had already decided that human space would become Valith space, and the summit was just the ceremony that made it look civilized. Ortega sat down and closed her eyes for exactly 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, she thought about every diplomatic failure in human history. She thought about treaties signed under duress that led to greater wars. She thought about leaders who chose peace at any price, and paid that price in the blood of the people who trusted them. She thought about Chamberlain and Munich and the piece of paper that meant nothing. She thought about every time in human history when someone had stood at a table and been told that surrender was the reasonable option. Then she opened her eyes and told her team to prepare for a final session. Chamber reconvened that afternoon, and the mood was different, in ways that the alien delegations could feel but not quite name. The Veilith seemed eager, as though they expected the humans to finally bend. The Rithani mediator had positioned itself closer to the center of the chamber. Even the silent Tohari envoy had shifted its massive body forward by a fraction. Ortega stood. She did not sit. She stood, which was itself a breach of protocol that made Soval's water column ripple with displeasure. "I have a statement to make," she said, "and I will ask the chamber to hear it in full before responding." Protocol demanded that she be heard. Soval gave assent with visible reluctance. Ortega activated the chamber's own holographic display system, the massive ring of light that usually showed star maps and treaty boundaries, and fed her data directly into it. The chamber filled with light. Ship signatures, Veilith ship signatures, 2,200 of them, displayed with timestamps that showed movement beginning 6 days ago, 3 full days before the summit had opened, coordinates that traced a clear and unmistakable path toward the Callaway corridor, energy readings consistent with weapons systems being charged and held at ready state. "These are Veilith fleet movements," Ortega said, her voice steady and clear, "recorded over the past 6 days by United Terran Navy monitoring stations, and independently verified by 3 separate intelligence sources." The Veilith Dominion began repositioning its invasion fleet 72 hours before this summit convened. The fleet currently comprises approximately 2,200 warships, including 12 Planet Cracker dreadnoughts, and is staged in attack formation along the Callaway corridor. The chamber was absolutely silent. Ortega continued. She displayed conclave communication logs that showed Rithani intelligence reports, flagging the Veilith movements and being marked as noted, no action required. She displayed trade agreements between the Rithani and the Veilith that had been signed in the same month the summit was announced. Agreements that granted the Rithani favorable terms in 3 resource-rich systems that just happened to border Veilith space on the opposite side from humanity. She displayed the pattern, clear and complete, that showed the summit for what it was. Not a peace negotiation, but a funeral dressed up as a wedding. "The conclave of aligned species," Ortega said, and now there was something in her voice that was not anger exactly, but something colder and more permanent, "has presented itself as an impartial mediator in this dispute. The evidence before you shows that this is not the case. The evidence shows that the Veilith invasion of human space was planned before this summit was proposed, that the Conclave was aware of these plans, and that this summit was designed to occupy humanity's attention while the invasion force assembled." She looked around the chamber, at Sethic, whose mandibles had gone still for the first time since the talks began, at Soval, whose water column had darkened to a deep and murky blue, at the Tahari envoy, who had not moved, but whose crystalline eyes were focused on the holographic display with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "Humanity came to this table in good faith," Ortega said. "We answered the invitation because we believe that dialogue is better than destruction, and because we hoped, perhaps naively, that the elder species of this galaxy would deal with us honestly." She paused, and the pause was not for effect. It was because what she was about to do would change everything, and she wanted to remember the exact moment it happened. "We will not leave this table in ignorance. These talks are concluded." She turned and walked toward the chamber doors, and behind her, one by one, every member of the human delegation stood and followed. They did not rush. They did not look back. They walked with the steady, unhurried pace of people who had made a decision and were completely at peace with it. The chamber erupted. Soval declared the walkout an act of diplomatic self-destruction unprecedented in conclave history, and called for sanctions. 3 minor delegations tried to call for a recess that was already meaningless. The Kraliv ambassador sat in its chair and watched the doors close behind the humans, with an expression that looked very much like respect. Overmind Sethek rose to his full height, his carapace expanding in the Phalith display of dominance, and his mandibles produced a sound that the translation systems rendered as a single sentence: "Then it will be quick." But the Tohari envoy, silent for 6 years, shifted its massive crystalline body and spoke for the first time since anyone in the chamber could. "Perhaps," the Tohari said, and the word fell like a stone into still water. And then it said nothing more. The Callaway Corridor was not a beautiful place. It was a narrow channel of navigable space squeezed between 2 nebulae. The ash veil on one side, a cloud of ionized gas that scrambled sensors and tore apart any ship foolish enough to enter it. And the Korath Deep on the other, a dark and ancient formation so dense with particulate matter that light itself seemed to give up halfway through. Between them lay a passage roughly 40 million kilometers wide and 200 million long, and it was the only viable route between Valith space and the human colonies beyond. Admiral Tobias Wren had been staring at maps of this corridor for 4 years, ever since the Valith had first begun making noise about expansion, and he had spent every one of those years preparing for the day when staring at maps would no longer be enough. That day had come. 72 hours after Ambassador Ortega walked out of the summit on Aethon Ring, the Valith invasion fleet entered the corridor from the far end. 2,200 warships arranged in the classic Valith assault formation, a wall of smaller attack craft screening the heavy capital ships behind them, with 12 planet-cracker dreadnoughts at the core, like the beating hearts of a machine built for only one purpose. The Valith expected to find token resistance. Their intelligence estimated that humanity could field perhaps 50 or 60 combat-capable vessels in the region, enough to make a symbolic stand before being overwhelmed. They expected the humans to fight briefly, die quickly, and serve as an example to any other nursery species that might one day think about saying no. What they found instead was Admiral Wren. The United Terran Navy's combat-ready forces were waiting at the human end of the corridor. 940 ships, every single warship that humanity could put into the void, arranged in a formation that the Valith tactical computers analyzed, could not classify because it did not match any known pattern in their database of 10,000 years of galactic warfare. The Valith paused, not out of fear, because the hive mind did not process fear the way individual beings did, but out of confusion. 940 ships was far more than expected, but still less than half the Valith force, and the formation made no sense to minds that had been winning wars since before humans had invented agriculture. Overmind Sethek, commanding from the dreadnought Eternal Hunger at the center of the fleet, ordered the advance to continue. The first Valith attack wave, 600 fast assault corvettes, surged forward at maximum speed, their weapons already charging, their targeting systems locking onto the nearest human ships. What happened next would be studied in war academies across the galaxy for centuries. The human formation split, not in the orderly way that galactic navies separated their forces, with clear communication lines and coordinated maneuvers, but in a way that looked almost chaotic. Ships breaking in seemingly random directions, squadrons dissolving and reforming in patterns that changed every 30 seconds. The Valith corvettes tried to track the movements and could not, because their battle computers were designed to predict the behavior of disciplined fleets that followed established doctrine. and the humans were not following any doctrine that existed in any database anywhere. Human tactical philosophy, the Valith would later learn, was built on a principle that no other galactic civilization had ever considered viable. Mission-type tactics, where individual captains were given an objective and nothing else. No specific instructions, no required formations, no predetermined responses. Just a goal and the freedom to achieve it, by whatever means they saw fit. It was messy and unpredictable, and absolutely terrifying to fight against. First Valith corvette died 4 minutes into the engagement. A human frigate called the Resolve had cut its engines entirely and drifted on an intercept course that looked like a disabled ship, until it was close enough to fire its kinetic accelerators at point-blank range. The accelerators were weapons the galaxy had never seen before, magnetic rail systems that launched tungsten slugs at 12% of the speed of light. And at that range the slugs punched through the corvette's hull like a fist through wet paper. Then the Resolve lit its engines and was gone before the debris had finished expanding. Across the corridor the battle erupted in full, and the galaxy learned what humanity had been building in the decades since it first ventured into the stars. Human ships were ugly, there was no other word for them, where Valith vessels were sleek and terrifying, and decorated with the trophies of conquered civilizations, and where Rathani ships were elegant works of art, and where Tohari ships were monolithic slabs of crystalline beauty, human ships looked like someone had welded a weapons platform to an engine and forgotten to add anything else. No ceremonial plating, no species markers, no broadcast arrays for intimidation displays. Every cubic meter of every human ship was dedicated to 3 things: weapons, armor, and the ability to move fast enough to use both. The Valith had 12 planet cracker dreadnoughts, each one capable of rendering a world uninhabitable. They were the pride of the Dominion, the largest warships in the Orion Arm, and they had never been defeated in battle. The human destroyer Furious Dawn defeated the first one. It was not a victory anyone would write a song about. The Furious Dawn was a small ship with a crew of 47, and what it did was accelerate to maximum speed on a direct collision course with the dreadnought Burning Mandate. And in the final seconds before impact, the crew activated the ship's kinetic accelerators at point-blank range, shredding the dreadnought's engine array, and then the Furious Dawn itself struck the crippled engine section and broke apart. The crew ejected after the impact was confirmed, not before, after. 47 men and women in emergency pods tumbling through the wreckage of 2 ships, and every single one of them survived. And the Burning Mandate, the largest warship the Valith had ever built, drifted dead and dark and powerless. The Valith hive mind processed this information, and for the first time in the battle, felt something that was not confusion, but was closer to it than anything the Overmind wanted to admit. The humans had weapons the galaxy did not know existed. The kinetic accelerators were only the beginning. There were directed gamma-ray burst projectors that could cook a ship's interior through its own hull, and autonomous drone swarms that operated on processing speeds faster than Valith. Battle computers could track, and something that the after-action reports from surviving Valith captains would simply call Hellfire Lances. The Hellfire Lances were the worst of it. They were energy weapons that operated on a frequency specifically tuned to resonate with metallic hull composites. When a Hellfire Lance struck a ship, it did not burn through the hull from outside. It heated the hull itself, turning the entire outer shell of the vessel into a conducting element that raised the interior temperature by hundreds of degrees in seconds. Valith ships became ovens, and the crews inside them died not from explosions or decompression, but from heat, which was a death that even the hive mind found difficult to process. The battle lasted 9 hours. 9 hours of chaos and fire, and the kind of desperate violence that only happens when one side is fighting for survival, and the other is slowly realizing that survival is no longer guaranteed for them either. The Valith lost 1,400 ships, more than half their fleet, including 4 of the 12 planet crackers, and the remaining 8 were damaged badly enough that they withdrew under escort. Humanity lost 310 ships, and every single one of those losses was felt. Human beings did not have a hive mind to absorb the grief. They carried it individually, every name and every face stored in the memory of someone who loved them. And Admiral Wren would later say that the cost of victory was not measured in ships, but in the letters he would have to write to families who would never be whole again. But the corridor held. The Valith pulled back, their fleet broken and bleeding, and for the first time in 4,000 years of conquest, the Dominion retreated from a battlefield without achieving its objective. Admiral Wren stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Unconquered, and watched the Valith signatures fade from his tactical display. His hands were steady, even though the rest of him was not. He had lost friends today, good people who had trusted him to spend their lives wisely, and he would carry that weight for as long as he lived. But there was one more thing to do. He opened a broadcast channel, all frequencies, unencrypted, so that every ship and every station and every listening post in the Orion Arm would hear it. And he spoke in a voice that was calm and tired and absolutely certain. "This is Admiral Tobias Wren of the United Terran Navy. The Callaway Corridor is closed. Any further attempts to transit this passage without authorization will be met with the same response you have witnessed today. Humanity suggests the Conclave of Aligned Species reconsider its definition of nursery species." He closed the channel and sat down heavily in his command chair, and said nothing else for a long time. Across the Orion Arm, in the halls of the Conclave, and in the war rooms of a dozen elder civilizations, and in the quiet private chambers, where beings of great age and great power sat alone with their thoughts. The message was received and replayed and analyzed and discussed. And everywhere, the conclusion was the same. The humans had come to the peace talks with open hands and reasonable questions, and a willingness to listen that the galaxy had mistaken for submission. But behind those open hands, behind those reasonable questions, behind every moment of patience and silence and restraint, there had been 940 warships crewed by men and women who had been ready to fight from the very first day. The galaxy had not been paying attention. It was paying attention now. 6 months after the Battle of the Callaway Corridor, the galaxy looked different. Not in the ways that most people would notice at first. The stars had not moved, and the trade routes still functioned, and the great machinery of interstellar civilization continued to turn. But underneath the surface, in the places where power actually lived, everything had shifted in ways that could not be undone. The Valith Dominion was breaking. Not quickly, because empires that have lasted 4,000 years do not collapse overnight. But the cracks were spreading faster than anyone had predicted. The loss at the corridor had done more than destroy 1,400 ships. It had destroyed something far more important, which was the idea that the Valith could not be beaten. 3 of the Dominion's vassal species, civilizations that had been conquered and absorbed centuries ago, and had long since stopped imagining freedom, watched the battle footage that the humans had broadcast openly across the Orion Arm, and saw something they had not seen before, which was a Valith fleet running away. The Drenari were the first to defect. They were a small mammalian species that the Valith had conquered 800 years ago, and they had served as laborers and technicians for so long that most of the galaxy had forgotten they were a separate species at all. But they remembered, and when they saw the Valith retreat from the corridor, they sent a message to the human embassy on Ethon Ring that said simply, "We wish to talk." The Keloth followed within a month, and the Vas Vanta a month after that. And suddenly, the Dominion's internal structure, which had seemed as permanent as stone, was revealed to be as fragile as everything built on fear turns out to be when the fear stops working. Overmind Sethek did not survive the political consequences. He was deposed by his successor in the traditional Valith manner, which meant he was consumed. And the new Overmind immediately pulled all Valith forces back behind their original borders, and made no public statements about humanity at all, which was the loudest statement the Valith had ever made. The conclave of aligned species was in worse shape than the Dominion, though the damage was less visible. The Rithani Collective attempted to recover its credibility by proposing a new peace summit, this time framing humanity not as a nursery species, but as an emerging partner in galactic governance. A change in language so dramatic that several elder species publicly mocked Soval for having the gall to suggest it. But the real damage to the conclave was happening in private. 7 species withdrew their diplomatic support within the first 3 months, not because they sided with humanity, but because Ortega's presentation at the summit had exposed the conclave's corruption so thoroughly that remaining a member became a political liability. Sell out one species for trade concessions, it would sell out any of them, and suddenly the 12,000-year-old institution that had governed the Orion Arm looked less like a governing body and more like a protection racket. Several elder species began opening direct diplomatic channels with Earth, bypassing the conclave entirely. The Kraliv were first, because they had been laughing at the conclave longer than anyone, and they respected the humans for reasons that had nothing to do with politics, and everything to do with the fact that the Kraliv were warriors themselves, and they knew courage when they saw it. The most significant visitor came unannounced. The Tohari Ascendancy had served as the conclave's enforcers for millennia. They were the oldest active civilization in the Orion Arm, silicon-based beings of enormous size and patience, and they had maintained their position not through aggression, but through the simple fact that no one had ever been able to challenge them, and no one had ever given them a reason to doubt their own judgment. They sent a single envoy to Earth. The envoy arrived aboard a Tohari vessel that was itself the size of a small moon, and it descended to the surface in a transport that had to land in the ocean off the coast of Brazil, because there was no structure on land large enough to accommodate it. The envoy waded ashore like a mountain walking out of the sea, crystalline and ancient, and so heavy that its footsteps left craters in the beach. Ambassador Ortega and Admiral Wren met the envoy together, standing on a platform that had been hastily constructed on the shore, dwarfed by the being that stood before them in the afternoon sun. The Tohari envoy looked at them for a long time. Tohari perception operated on timescales that made human patience look like impulsiveness. And when the envoy finally spoke, its words came through the translator in a voice like stones grinding together in deep water. And we have maintained order in this arm of the galaxy for 12,000 years, it said. In that time, we have watched species rise and fall and rise again. We have seen empires that spanned 1,000 systems crumble to dust. We have seen nursery civilizations grow old and wise, and nursery civilizations burn themselves to nothing. In all of that time, across all of those ages, no species has surprised us. The envoy paused, and in the pause, the waves broke against its legs, and the sun moved across the sky, and Ortega and Wren stood very still. You have surprised us, the envoy said. This is not entirely unwelcome. Then it turned and walked back into the ocean, and its transport rose from the water and returned to the ship above. And the Tahari vessel departed without another word, which was more communication than the Tahari had offered any species in 6 years. Ortega and Wren stood on the platform and watched it go. Means, Wren asked. I think it means we passed a test we did not know we were taking, Ortega said. In the weeks that followed, humanity made its position clear, not through threats or demands, but through a series of diplomatic communications that were notable for their restraint. Ortega issued a formal statement on behalf of the United Terran government. Humanity sought no empire, no dominion, and no vengeance. It would not pursue the Valith into their own territory, it would not demand reparations, and it would not use its victory as leverage to claim systems that were not already its own. But it would defend its people, its territory, and its right to exist with everything it had. And it would never again sit at a table where the outcome had been decided before the conversation began. The statement was translated into 400 languages and broadcast across the Orion Arm, and it was received with reactions that ranged from relief to respect to applause, something that some of the older and wiser species recognized as the beginning of a new era. On a warm evening 3 months after the Tohari visit, Ortega stood before the United Terran Parliament in Geneva, the old chamber with its wooden panels and its history and its smell of old paper and new purpose, and she delivered the address that would be remembered long after everything else about this period was forgotten. She spoke about the colonies, about the schools on Elysium, and the fishing boats on Port Haldane, and the singing on New Svalbard. She spoke about the 310 ships that did not come home from the corridor, and the families that would carry that absence forever. She spoke about the galaxy and its long history, and humanity's small but stubborn place in it. And then a member of Parliament asked her what message she would send to the galaxy now. And she paused for a moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because she wanted to. Humanity has always preferred peace, she said. We build schools before we build warships. We write poetry before we write battle plans. But we have learned, through our own long and bloody history, that the price of peace is the willingness to fight for it. The galaxy offered us a lesson in politics. We offered one in return. The chamber was silent, and then it was not. And the sound that filled it was not applause exactly, but something deeper and older, the sound of a species recognizing itself in the words of one of its own. Across the Orion Arm, in the embassy halls and war rooms, and the quiet chambers where beings of great age and great power contemplated the long arc of civilizations, a new understanding settled into place. Not like a sudden revelation, but like the slow turning of a tide, the kind of change that seems obvious only after it has already happened. Humanity had come to the peace talks with open hands, had asked reasonable questions,